Hello and welcome to the Daily Friend Show. We are here coming to you on Friday, the day after the 200th anniversary of the 1820 settlers. It's an important day to remember. I think we live in a country that has this sort of everything about colonialism was terrible attitude. A lot of people who arrived did a lot of good work and have given a lot to this country. And it's an important moment to remember sort of two flavors coming to mix together in the same pot. And if we get this right as South Africans, that'll be part of designing a recipe for a distinguished dish on the world's buffet. We are somber here at the Institute of Race Relations today. We're drawing towards the end of January, where submissions will close if things stay on track for comments on the current gazetted bill for expropriation and setting out terms for where expropriation of property could occur without compensation or for less than market value. And just on Wednesday, a statement was released by Matole Motshekga, who's an NEC member of the ANC, to say effectively that the gazetted bill no longer represents the ANC's position. He says this comes straight from the Lekgotla, straight from Ramaphosa, and that they feel a further step needs to be taken. So I am joined here with my colleagues Anthea Jeffery, Terence Corrigan, and these are our two experts, I think, on expropriation without compensation and the ideology that undergirds the ANC's National Democratic Revolution project, and Hermann Pretorius, who's running a campaign on this question at the moment. Anthea, I suppose let's just give our listeners a refresh on where we are in the process, and I think if you can tell us a bit about what concerns us about Motshekga's comments in general, that might also be helpful.
In December last year, just as the festive season began, the ad hoc committee for the drafting of legislation to amend the Constitution to allow EWC gazetted a bill. It's called the Draft Constitution Amendment, 18th Amendment Bill. Comments on it are due by the end of this month. And what it basically says is that the courts will have the option to decide that nil compensation should be paid, not only for land, but also for the improvements on it. And in addition, that Parliament will have the power to adopt subsequent legislation by ordinary 51% majority, saying when no compensation can be ordered by the courts. Now, this is worrying enough in itself, but at least it does give the power to decide on nil compensation to the judiciary. Now the ANC's idea, as reflected at the recent Lekgotla and incorporated in a statement by President Ramaphosa thereafter, is that the decisions on compensation should be made by the executive and not by the courts. So in other words, if your property, your home, which is the improvement on your piece of land that you own, is going to be expropriated, say by the housing department because it says it wants social housing, much more dense housing in that area, then the minister would be able to decide not only that the property should be expropriated, but also that you should get no compensation for it. And that's an extraordinary thing because it goes right against the separation of powers and the idea that the courts must act as a check on the executive. And it will be much more difficult for individuals to contest that. If the courts have the power to adjudicate, to make their own rulings on what compensation will be, they will look at all the factors which they consider important. If all that they can do is review a decision that's been made by the executive, then the grounds for review are much more limited. In essence, whether the decision is so unreasonable that no proper decision maker could have made it. So there will still be some role for the courts, but they'll only be able to review on these limited grounds set out in the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act, and they won't ever be able to substitute their own view on what compensation should be. So if they strike the executive's decision down, well, then the executive will come with a new decision. And if you don't like that, then you must go back to court for another review. And again, the courts can at most say, no, we don't approve, but we can't decide. So it becomes a much longer and more costly process, which means that if you want to try and contest being offered nil or a very small amount of compensation, you have a much more difficult path before you and a much more costly one.
And if I can follow that question up with, so there's this new, more radical idea the idea being put forward at the Lekgotla, but the idea that we currently have gazetted is also got problems. One of them is the idea that if I understand correctly, your property can be expropriated without compensation. And then afterwards you have to go to appeal, and the burden of proof is almost on you, and certainly the costs for the legal action are going to fall on you. And at a time when you've just had your property taken out. If it's your home, that's going to be a very important thing. And if it's your business, that's going to wipe out your ability to earn you money. So that makes it difficult as well. So tell me if I've got that wrong. And then it seems to me, has the government put forward a formula for how to think about what the compensation value should be in the first place? I feel like you've written about that before.
Well, what we're seeing is a gradual ratcheting up of the pressure, because we already know from the Expropriation Bill of 2019 that was gazetted at the end of 2018 that the whole process for expropriation is very much skewed in favor of the state. That having taken certain preliminary steps like investigating your property and seeing whether they think it's suitable, they can issue a notice of expropriation. And that notice will specify the date on which ownership will pass automatically by operation of law to the government. And that date could be very soon. It could be within a week of your getting the notice of expropriation. They'll also say when the right to possess the property will pass automatically to the state. And that could be within another week or a few days. And though under the existing expropriation bill, you'd have the right to go to court for a different ruling on what the compensation should be, for most people, reeling from the loss of the right to own and possess their properties, it's not a very real option. But it will become even less real if the courts can't make a ruling on what compensation should be. They can only say, we disagree with the amount that you've been offered by the executive, but we can't substitute our own view. If you're not happy with the new amount that's given by the executive, well, then you must come back to us again. It just makes it such an enormous burden that for most ordinary people, it's not feasible at all to try and invoke what will remain as the court's power to review. And it will mean that the executive will effectively be able to decide on zero compensation in almost any circumstances, because we don't have clear parameters on when that will apply.
Especially when they're going after the most vulnerable. Now, in this interview on ENCA with Matole Motshekga, the journalist speaking asked questions like, is this a big turnaround? Is this, he used the phrase, a jiggy, a little bit sneaky, I'm quoting again, of the ANC to put forward the Gazette and then say that we want a more radical approach. And he said in particular, asked a further poignant question, or pertinent question, which was, who guards the guardians? If the executive has this power de facto to decide who's going to get no compensation, and the recourse to the courts is as limited as possibly can be, how can we trust the executive not to abuse that power? To which the answer was, well, the executive is the representative of the people, and we're really good at doing our jobs. Terence, do you want to talk us through a little bit of the track record we have at the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform, and more broadly in the administration of land reform?
Well, I think that that sort of argument, we are the people, that was first used in the French Revolution. You can chop off people's heads because we are the people and we know what we're doing. I think it is very much a part of the ANC's worldview. About 15 years ago, there was a wonderful line in one of its papers about how it is the most important moral voice in any question facing the country. This is a particular self-conception. In reality, I think that you would find very, very few people in South Africa, and I'm willing to, bet a fair amount, not my property, that there are many people in the ANC who will roll their eyes at that suggestion. It's interesting that the same state which which has been overseeing a land reform program, which the ANC says has not succeeded, that has overseen things like ESCOM, like the Road Accident Fund, etc., SAA, is the one demanding ever more power and ever more discretion to intrude on private property, whether it's held by private individuals or by businesses. I think another interesting thing, we talk about the executive, and the assumption is somehow this is ministers and elevated personages. It remains to be seen how this will play out. But if you for instance read the advisory panel on land reform, they want to extend this to very many institutions. So it could, for instance, be your local municipality, many of which are in a dreadful state and are essentially run as patronage machines. There is an enormous amount to be feared here, and if I could just add on the jiggy question, we have a situation. This whole process is sort of unfolded in small parcels, each of which might seem fairly innocuous or something that can be accepted and moved on from. I think here we've kind of reached the red line, where we've gone from making explicit that which is implicit, just a snip here and a tuck there, to, well, this fundamentally changes the relationship between the individual and the state to which he or she is subject. So no, I think there is a great deal to be deeply concerned about, and I think that on the question of being sneaky, well, I wonder whether this wasn't the sort of play, if not sort of written up in a document kept in a safe somewhere, but the thinking that you can gradually, that you can incrementally increase and expand that latitude. And I would like to suggest that something else that we might see disappearing is the explicit reference in that amendment to land.
Yeah.
And I think we could well find that we end up with something, or a proposal where the executive gets to decide what property it wants to take. So pension funds, shares in companies, intellectual property, all that sort of thing, which I think is a great deal more enticing than 1,000 hectares in the Northern Cape, could become fair game.
Yeah, I think the phrase is like boiling a frog in water without a lid. You just slowly increase the temperature, and every increment doesn't seem to cross the line. Of course, I spoke to a farmer who said he tried it and the frog jumps out.
Well, I'm scared of frogs myself.
So I think those frogs who can jump are trying, and those who can't are stuck in a very hard place. To specify on the incompetence of the state, as bad as so many of the bigger, well-known things are, I mean, if you look at the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform, so corrupt is it that last year the Constitutional Court ruled that it as a ministry is not competent to discharge its duties. And so a special master had to be appointed by the court effectively to take over that function. So that department is probably the most corrupt department that there is.
Well, stiff competition.
Amongst very stiff competition. And the decentralized point of sending it to municipalities is hugely concerning, because so many of our municipalities are bankrupt effectively, unable to collect taxes. And the problem with the patronage network is when you can't get the money in to then redistribute, you start getting desperate. And that might be when you start looking to land to grab and then resell. In terms of there's been a development in the the David Rockefeller case that I think speaks to this sort of desperate greed that is... Anyway, Terence, tell us a bit about that, please.
Well, my chuckle was cynical, not amused. Yes, what happened there was that this gentleman, sort of a poster boy for the black farming class that to which government is nominally committed, had an agreement with the government, I think dated from about 2003, to buy the state-owned land that he had been working successfully. Apparently, it was even being used as a training ground for other aspirant farmers. And then, the wheels grind slowly, and I think 7 or 8 years later they decided actually they weren't going to go through with the sale. Now, it says something about 7 or 8 years. You try buying a car and having to wait 7 or 8 years for them to sign the papers, but be that as it may. But toing and froing, eventually he took the government to court and he said he wants to buy the land, not that he wants a freebie or anything. He wants to pay money. He had a land invasion which he couldn't have these people evicted because he had no locus standi because he didn't own, and the judge was absolutely scathing, and he said this is just irrational, unreasonable, and counter-constitutional. Within 30 days, have the sale done at the conditions applicable in 2003, which was 621,000 rand. Well, as we say, the wheels ground slowly, and a couple of days ago, this would have been about 4 months after the case was adjudicated, he received an offer to sell it for 5.5 million. In other words, 9 times.
To buy it for 5.5.
Yeah, yes. And his attorneys say they're going to be taking this to. This actually is a charge of contempt.
Contempt of court.
Contempt of court. I think, and and this is where it becomes distinctly unamusing, that what this is about is a pathological refusal to extend property rights, to the point that what they're hoping for is not so much to win the case in its legal merits, which they've lost, but to make that transfer impossible through various administrative and practical hurdles, and to hope that at 79 years old the problem will soon go away.
Herman, I feel like you've got something to add here.
Yeah, well, I think if contempt of court is, I think, perfect. What we see from the ANC is exactly that. I have no factual evidence for this, but it's not beyond reason that the ANC saw what happened in the Rockefeller case, and that motivated them to perhaps shut out the courts even further, because here they are offering to sell the farm to Mr. Rockefeller at 9 times the price. So if the court had determined the price in this instance of Mr. Rockefeller, then it would have very much been in favor of the individual and not in favor of the state. And here we might even see, if we're going to talk about contempt of court, this whole idea of excluding the court from an already dodgy deal is just contempt for the court. And I think the question then becomes, why do they want to get the courts out? And the excuse we heard was that the courts take so long. But that is going directly against what Kgalema Motlante's high-level panel found, that land reform was not slow or inept because of the courts or because of the constitution. It was the government. And now the administration, and now that same administration wants to take back the powers the high level found it to be awful at using. I mean, it's contemptuous.
Right, so it's like the disease, you've got arsenic poisoning, add more arsenic.
Yes, exactly.
I want to bring in I was a bit confused. I see Ferial Hafaji has an article out today on the sort of World Economic Forum and the Lekgotla and where the ANC is going with this, and she talks about land expropriation without compensation. I think she's a veteran journalist in this country. I think she's very important. I think a lot of people take her seriously. And she writes that the government has passed amendments to Section 25 of the Constitution to make land expropriation more explicit than it has been, which is a strange way of wording it. The Constitution has not yet been amended. In addition, she goes on to write, it sets out a long process that must be followed before the land is expropriated, and it allows for zero compensation as legitimate in certain instances. The instances aren't certain. Its list is sort of open-ended. But then thirdly, she says the ANC will campaign for public support of the amendments. Okay. What Ramaphosa has done here is take the land debate out of the realm of rhetoric and into the constitutional process. It's not popular, but neither is it populist. The ANC has bought into this process, and it's left the EFF isolated in its positioning around expropriation as a political bogey. There's something that I can't quite wrap my head around here, and maybe it's a particular instance of a broader problem of mistaking things for what they're not. I don't understand how this is popular but not populist. I mean, I would understand that if the line was, the Institute of Race Relations and everyone else who's done any surveys on this has found that land reform is not a priority, that even EFF voters would much rather have jobs and better education and safer streets than 1,000 hectares in the Northern Cape, as you put it, humorously, but then having people's land expropriated without compensation. So in that sense, land reform, the way that they talk about it, is not populist. But I think there's a deeper complaint that I have with the media is setting up this dichotomy where either we have what the ANC is offering, and the best way to do it is by the book, and because it's by the book, it's not going to lead us into trouble, or we have the status quo. So Anthea, can you tell us a little bit about what the real alternative is, and why it's so important that we do have a real alternative to this resting either with the courts or with the executive, this idea that a lot of land can just go for nil compensation as a route to addressing the problem. How can we really do land reform, and why is it important that we can really do land reform?
Well, I think we have to get away from the notion that it's the compensation that's been paid for land, the price that's been paid for land so far, that's been the real obstacle, either in rural areas where it's farming land that's an issue, or in urban areas where people are desperate for land for housing. That's where the real hunger is. So if we unpack that a bit more, in the rural areas, we do have a small proportion of people who very much want to farm. And David Rockefeller is one of them, and he's being barred from getting on with it by everything that Terence was talking about, and particularly his lack of title. And this was something that the high-level panel highlighted too. They said that the beneficiaries, so-called, of land reform are being denied ownership because the government wants to keep all land which it acquires for land reform for itself. That means they can't access working capital, and that's the first requirement that you need for success in farming, among a whole lot of others as well, ranging from electricity and labor to infrastructure and markets and so on, and the capacity to withstand drought and crime and any number of other obstacles. So it is possible to do land reform properly, but the key thing is to recognize that the real need is to expand the number of commercial farmers. How many hectares you transfer only to see those hectares fall out of production is not the way to go. It's not the key concern. The key concern is how to expand the number of commercial farmers. For that you need, first of all, title. You need money to make available. And the Agri-SA and other farming organizations have come up with a whole number of practical ideas about how you can put together a sort of blended finance model where you get partly money from the state, partly money from private sector. We've suggested that you could have land reform bonds that many people would actually be glad to invest in if it would help a sensible process of expanding the number of commercial farmers. But you must also make sure they have the right skills, which means, again, you need the existing commercial farmers to help them. And you need the infrastructure, the markets, and partly that depends on government. But increasingly, it means that where you need, for example, a road or a dam, that it should be built on a public-private partnership, because trusting the state to do with its administrative inefficiency is just a recipe for long delay and over endlessly rising costs, as we've seen with Eskom. So what we've said in the rural areas is that you need basically an Ipolazi proposal to try and make it easier for farmers to farm. And in the urban areas, what you need is to make it easier for people to gain access to housing. And the private sector used to build quite a lot of low-cost housing. They've stopped doing it because they can't get access to serviced land. Getting the land is only the part of the problem. After that, you've got to get the state to provide the services and the approvals and the permits. And what should be quite a quick process will take anything between 3 and 10 years. So again, it's not the compensation that you have to pay for land or the price that you have to pay for it that's the issue. It's enormous administrative incompetence, the slow process on the part of the state to build the houses that are required, very often corruption in the housing contracts that are handed out, so that what is built in the end is so badly built that in some instances you just have to start again, or you have to spend a great deal on repairing what should have been done properly in the first place. And the houses are tiny, they're built on the urban periphery. It's just been the wrong model in every way. And again, you could empower people in a real way by giving them housing vouchers, by taking some of the budget that's being so poorly spent on housing and giving vouchers for housing only to people below a certain income. And then they could decide how they want to use those vouchers, whether they want to borrow from the banks, perhaps using that to top up what they can borrow in any event, whether they're living in an informal settlement and they can now start upgrading their own home rather than having to wait for the government to do it. And if the private sector was aware that those housing vouchers are in place and that there's now a much bigger housing market, and again, if they could partner with the government on all the administrative bottlenecks which hold up the process, then you could have a pipeline of flats and other housing coming into the market, which many people would be empowered to buy, or they could start setting up, particularly in the informal settlements, their own structures on a much more sophisticated and satisfactory basis than is now possible.
And just to give an indication of how far we're going in the opposite direction. The South African Reserve Bank's report at the end of last year, finding that the economic state is still dismal, that we're still in the longest downward business cycle since the record was began somewhere after World War II, said one of the key leading indicators, the biggest drag on the leading indicators that we have, is a further decrease in residential building plans being approved. So I think a lot of our listeners or viewers will be familiar with stories about people emigrating, about the major property developers talking about the increased portion of housing sales going from people who are moving out of the country. That's one of the problems. But we've also got this problem of not building new houses at the rate that we really need to be doing. Never mind to satisfy the huge increasing demand for urban living in South Africa, a radically urbanizing country, but even just to sort of keep up with where we are at the moment. So this is pretty bleak. Of course, on top of that, we've got the Land Bank, whose core competency is supposed to be providing credible credit to farmers, especially being junked by Moody's. They seem to indicate that they don't think that the fiscus is going to keep being able to bail out the Land Bank for toxic debt that it has on its books. And that seems to bode poorly for the upcoming Moody's rating on the sovereign South African debt. One of the big things that we haven't talked about yet is the role of banks more broadly in this. So we see this positive role that they could play. At the moment, they're not. That's a sort of idea that the IRR is putting out there, and that seems to be generally quashed both in the corridors of power and by major media players who, as I say, think land reform either means sort of punishing some little farmer or some little house owner and taking their stuff away without compensation, and they don't see an alternative sort of upward growth trajectory for land reform. But the banks stand to be hugely burnt in this country, and that would be massively, the repercussions of that would be huge, given the fact that the banking sector makes up, let's say, a fifth or a quarter of GDP in South Africa. It's one of the really sophisticated and value-add oriented parts of our industry. Hermann, where do the banks stand on this?
Well, that's exactly what we want to find out. There's a tendency in South Africa, and I mean, you see this even during apartheid, of a slowness in taking up issues or policy problems that might, in the health sector, something like NHI, be detrimental to the sector, and now in banking. We need to get some clarity from the banks on this. And in this regard, the Institute has launched an open letter campaign, writing to the 6 major banks, or 6 of the most prominent and major banks in South Africa, essentially asking them a very simple question. If a client of yours has their property expropriated, would you expect them to still pay off the debt they had on that property and the bond? It's a simple question. So we just want to know that we started with the trauma of losing your property, but then we need to get clarity from the banks. Once you've been exposed to that trauma, would the banks then expose you to a second trauma, saying not only did you lose your asset, your home, your farm, your business, but we still expect you to pay us the money that you owed on that piece of property? Now, it's a very simple question, but I think the answers will be quite revealing, and we've given the banks until the 29th of January, next week, to give us some clarity on this point, because South Africans deserve to know. This isn't just an issue that you can isolate from the everyday management of finance. If you're a bank, you have a stake in this. You have a stake in the economy, being strong, and you need to come clean with your clients and say, if this becomes reality, there are going to be some severe repercussions, not on the macroeconomic or microeconomic, but on a financial level. Your wallet will be claimed by a bank because your property was taken by the state. We need an answer on whether that's going to happen.
And so I suppose the thought is, if the bank says we still expect you to pay that back, then that seems kind of crazy in a way. One of the things that seems crazy is, how do you expect people to be able to pay you back? Another is, why do you expect people to be eager to pay you back? And the thing is, if you don't expect people to pay you back, then you're just writing off that loan.
Exactly.
And one of the things about banks, one of the reasons our banks are so good, is because they're quite leveraged.
Yes.
Now, they're not as leveraged as the sort of crazy capitalist cowboy institutions like J.P. Morgan and Bear Stearns and Freddie, I think to some degree even Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae were, but they are still heavily leveraged. It's the point of banking that if I get a bunch of money from you guys coming in and I expect to get a bunch more money, then I lend out even more than that. So if I have to write off 5% of my book as now a toxic asset, that can make it impossible for me to sustain the loans that I've got out there. And if I have to withdraw them, or I'm unable to allow people to withdraw their funds, you get a run on credit, you get a credit freeze. And that's what the 2008 housing crisis sort of looked like in America. And it was a relatively small portion of assets that turned out to be toxic there. But it brought down the whole world's economy.
Yes. And that, who owns the debt is essentially the 180, 150 billion rand question.
Right. And that 180 billion rand, that's just agricultural debt.
Yes.
And if we get to what Terence was saying about if land doesn't appear here, and what Anthea was saying, we are already gazetting the idea that it's the improvements that can also be expropriated without compensation. You've already lost touch with the thought that God gave us X amount of land and that's all there is. There's also this human value add stuff that can be taken. Then you start looking at the 2 trillion, 3 trillion rand property market in South Africa, which is quite heavily leveraged, and ripping that out from under our feet. And then there's hardly a South African, at that point, even Julius Malema is going to be worried about all of the money that he hasn't yet managed to hide in Dubai or wherever, right? Anyone who's sitting with any South African access at that point, no one's going to be big enough to be able to resist that. Okay, so this is serious stuff. This is an extraordinary time. We have till the end of the month to keep making submissions. The Institute's certainly going to be doing that. We're going to be posting, I think it's okay for me to say, a pre-seed version of the submissions that we're making to the South African government, to the Parliament. Please check that out on the Daily Friend. Sign up and spread the word. This is not something that we can sit quietly by and allow to happen. And if you have debt, if you have a bank card, if you have a relationship with a financial institution that's at all connected to the property market, pick up the phone and make a call, or go down to the store, to the brick and mortar place, and ask them what are they doing to make sure that you or they aren't going to be scorched by this and left in a position where you cannot look forward to tomorrow as a time where you have what you worked for today.
And also go to the IRR website and click on the button that asks the question whether banks will essentially be selling you out. Will your bank be selling you out on EWC? And there's a space there where you can say you have a bond to pay off, and you can put in which financial institution you have this contract with. And you can ask the IRR. Together we can apply the necessary pressure to get the answers, to get the clarity, so that people can know what the consequences of this policy will be for themselves. And that's what the IRR wants to do with this campaign. Please join us.
Do it for yourself, do it for your friends, do it for your family, and spread the word. It's for serious. Thank you.